Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast. I am joined by a new guest today, Terminal Philosophy. We're here to discuss the geopolitics of Germany, and I think the first place to start is geography itself. So Germany begins the geographic idea described by Tacitus in his Germania, and Germany, broadly speaking, in the Tacitus's conception, is the land between the Rhine and the Vistula. And that would continue until the end of World War II, where now it's between the Rhine and the Oder. But if we look at what is there, to the north is Scandinavia. To the east is what we would essentially call the European steppe, which stretches from Poland to Manchuria. And often many of the ancient invaders of Germany would have come from that place. And then to the west is the Rhine and the Low Countries, which creates a sort of natural barrier. To the south are the Alps. And really what we have is, if you look at Germany, its right flank, its left flank and its southern flank are essentially fixed. Mountainous terrain in the south and a river on the left side. To the north, it's kind of open, but Scandinavia has got such a low population density, it never really amounted to much of a threat to the German state. The location to the east is really where most of what Germany's efforts for politics, geopolicy, is going to come from. And so if we just look at Germany as a geographic idea, those are many of the salient features. Terminal Philosophy, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I just wanted to say too that in addition to the Rhine and the Alps being natural barriers militarily and sort of just kind of figurative barriers in general, that the Oder is still considered, I think, a good barrier to that, as well as the Danube, because the Danube actually connects Munich to the Black Sea, so that I think for a long time, since the Middle Ages, Germanic peoples were able to connect with peoples of Europe, Eastern Europe, easier that way. And I think the only Eastern physical barriers I can think of are really the Oder, and then just for World War II's case, the Silo Heights, or I think it's pronounced the Silo Heights, but that's not anything major or grandiose like the Rhine or the Alps. And I'm sure we'll get into it later, but yeah, the Northern European plain it's still a very important variable in the modern German geopolitical situation. Yeah, I think that's what I'd have to say to that.
Yeah, now Germany moves from a merely geographic idea in the age of the Romans to a political ideal with Charlemagne. And I think not only Germany, but one would argue Europe itself, because if you look at the civilized parts of Europe prior to Charlemagne, they were parts of the Roman Empire, and they didn't really have a, quote, European identity, unquote. They had a imperial Roman identity. So someone living in Gaul under the Roman Empire had more in common with an Egyptian than with a German. That's because the culture was Romanitas, this Roman civic culture. Charlemagne creates this European Christian Germanic culture, which reorients the entire focus of Western Europe and begins to give us the political foundations for what we would consider the state of Germany. And in fact, when he dies and his kingdom is broken up into East, Middle, and West Francia, East Francia becomes the nuclei of the Holy Roman Empire and what is colloquially called the First Reich. And so this ideal of a German empire, of a united German state, in later centuries will be harkened back to as what should be, or what was lost, what should be the case. And we begin to see with Charlemagne, and then by extension East Francia and the Holy Roman Empire, the beginning of the role that Germany will play in European geopolitics. So because we mentioned the geographic aspects of Germany, most of its strategic energy is going to be faced to the east. And we see this with Charlemagne's conquest of the Avars in what is today roughly Austria. And then the defeat of the Magyars by Otto the Great at Lechfeld, Holy Roman Emperor. And this sort of shield of the West vis-a-vis the East is the historic geopolitical role that Germany falls into time and time again. In part, it's geographically necessitated, but in part, it's also because Germany has this European consciousness, right? We don't see this prior to Charlemagne, because if we look at the Germanic tribes in the 5th century, they often collaborated with Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun, a nomadic Eastern invader. They didn't make a distinction. They didn't say, we're Europeans, we're going to fight the Huns. In fact, even the Visigoths, who were settled in France, were so unreliable that basically Aetius had to sort of bribe them and strong arm them to fight Attila. So there's this sort of strategic geopolitical role of the shield of the West against the East the Germanic people had not yet developed into. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. As for like Germanic, like a psychological German idea of like a unification wouldn't come till much later. Honestly, until the time of Napoleon, kind of when Hegel said, "Oh, I saw the world spirit on horseback," when he was referring to Napoleon and his armies coming through as like this unified national entity, as opposed to, oh, you're a feudal subject, or this, what you were talking about with the Visigoths, that was even before then. There was so much warring between Germanic tribes for centuries, even while having problems with Rome. And like we were talking about in our private correspondence, Arminius, really gained most of his success by being brought up in Rome and then changing sides when it suited him best. And that's, so yeah, we can get into how German unification kind of came about, but honestly, I think there's a lot of people that have a misconception that there was some sort of unifying German psychological ethos at that time, and that's just not the case. I mean, the only like pan-European idea going on was the Roman Imperium, and again, German nationalism, of course, stems straight from the French Revolution, so it wouldn't start until much later. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think, again, that this key historic turning point with Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire sort of demonstrates what role a politically unified Germany will play in the future, and because they sort of are a preview of that. Now, the next major development in the idea of Germany from a geographic to a political with the Holy Roman Empire, now to a cultural identity. And Germany as a cultural identity is largely a result of the Reformation. Now, you could argue, Southern Germany is still Catholic and Rhineland is still Catholic. That's true. But obviously, we'll get to it later, when Germany's unified, it's unified by the Protestant state of Prussia. And when we think of Germans as a cultural aspect, we think of hard work, thrift, honesty, technical excellence, highly literate, highly sophisticated. All of these traits that we associate with the German culture are not yet present in Charlemagne or the Holy Roman Empire. If in the Middle Ages, the center of technology and manufacture would have been Italy, or maybe the Low Countries in England with the Hanseatic League, you would not have associated that with Germany. But these Protestant traits, so literacy, which of course the Reformation wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible, so it creates this broad base of a highly literate population, which is a precondition for scientific development. You need to have people that can go to university, people that can do mathematics and all of these high mental faculties. And with the Protestant Germany, it lifts a large amount of the mass of population out of this peasant squalor and is able to instruct them in this way. And we also have the sort of Protestant work ethic thesis of Weber, and the idea that the Germans have this pride in their work, with this idea of excellence. It's rooted in this sense of vocation that Weber points out. And so the beginning of a uniquely German culture with uniquely identifiable German traits, I think we begin to see in the Reformation.
Yeah, I think you're right. And one thing that we should probably add too on Charlemagne is that while there was no, a pan-Germanic idea at that time, Charlemagne still made decent contributions for that time in the sense that he was trying to at least stress a wider range of literacy amongst his population. Now, I think it was more biased towards the clergy and probably some nobles, but it was his affinity for reading and being scholarly was unique, I think, for his time, especially when he had the amount of power he did compared to other medieval rulers. So I think that he contributed some good preconditions for the Reformation. Yes, they were separated by several centuries, but I think that's worth mentioning. Yeah, as for the Reformation, you're absolutely right in the sense that where we talk about German organizational skills and now like a identifiable German ethos that definitely comes from the Reformation. And without sounding too cliche, a lot of Germanic national characteristics are sort of just sharpened more or less through the centuries from just persisting conflicts or social unrest. Even in 1871, the idea of like a strong national sovereignty was still pretty shaky at that time. But I think, and you and Right Ruminations talked, you had a good video on Martin Luther. And I think it would be good to mention too that, he never necessarily meant to break up the Catholic Church, but I think, he wanted it a more, what I guess you could say, like a more egalitarian form of Christianity to come about. And I think for whatever reason, for many reasons, that tore Germany to shreds. But out of that, I think you got an interesting leg up and maybe a unique perspective on how they went about the Industrial Revolution.
Now, the beginning of the modern state of Germany. Now, this is a point of contention. So, for example, in his book Iron Kingdom, now I'm having a brain fart. Do you remember who wrote Iron Kingdom, Terminal Philosophy? I think it was in the book Iron Kingdom, he argues that Prussia, while it created the state of Germany, was not itself. It was also the end of Prussia because the German state later subsumed Prussia. And I can see his argument, but I do find it sort of unconvincing because if you look at the German nation state, it was produced by the Kingdom of Prussia in the 19th century, and without the Kingdom of Prussia, there just never would have been a nation state of Germany. It's very difficult to imagine it happening otherwise. So when we look at the beginning of Germany, we have to look at the beginning of the state of Prussia. Now, the Duchy of Brandenburg goes way back to like the 15th century, and it's tied to briefly the Kingdom of Luxembourg. It sort of isn't really known for anything special yet. Brandenburg really becomes supercharged when the East Prussia, which converts to Protestantism in the early 16th century, then converts to Protestantism, and it stops being a papal sort of holy order society. And then eventually Brandenburg inherits Prussia through a marriage arrangement. And at this point, we begin to see sometime in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, the organization of this state. And the Prussian state then, the sort of coming of age is the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was a catastrophe for Germany, where Sweden, Holy Roman Empire, and France fought over Germany with other German princes for 30 years, killing close to 10 million people. And what necessitated the course that Brandenburg Prussia would later take was the fact that it had, at that point, no natural defensive boundaries. It had to focus on an army, becoming essentially Europe's Sparta, or to quote Voltaire, an army with a nation. But its geographic limitations entailed that. It had not yet expanded to the Rhine. It had not yet expanded to the Alps. And the East is just an open flank. So it had to be organized around the army because that was the only way in which that state could be preserved. And I think this is the last piece of the German puzzle, the idea that the Germans are known for being militarily superior. We have, in ancient times, the Goths and the Vandals who toppled the Roman Empire, and they seem to have a ferocious, reputation. In the Reformation Renaissance period, the German mercenaries, the Landsknechts, were second only to the Swiss. The British hired mercenaries from Hesse-Kassel in the American Revolution, calling them the Hessians. But it's really Prussia that creates this idea that German soldiers are the best. Man for man, they're worth, two of anybody else at least. And yeah, that's the last piece of the puzzle where German military excellence has now been added to their thrift industry and scientific prowess.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And to add to that, there would have been no Germany probably without Frederick the Great or William the First. And if you look at it by about 1871, how much land Prussia controlled. I mean, they had as far east as the Baltics, all the way across that flatter plain that borders with Denmark and to the Rhine. And by the time of the Frankfurt Parliament, I mean, I think they are the majority of Germanic lands, roughly speaking. And you're absolutely right. I mean, in the American Revolution, the Hessians, although they were defeated, they still brought a reputation with them from Europe as being really competent soldiers. So yeah, I think German military prowess didn't really become a thing until like the 17 and 1800s. So much later than I think a lot of people think.
Exactly. And one other aspect to this prowess is with regards to Sparta. Aristotle said Sparta was so successful because it was the first city-state to have a professional standing army instead of a hoplite militia. Now, once the other Greeks caught on, Sparta, because it was a rigid caste system and couldn't adapt to change, was eventually displaced. But in much the same way that Sparta was the first to professionalize war and therefore get the leg up on its Greek competitors, Prussia, during the age of Napoleon, created the general staff system. Basically, there's tactics, operations, and strategy. Tactics is basically utilizing troop movements within the range of the eyesight of a commander. So in a battlefield from ancient times up until Napoleon, the battle space is as far as you can see, maybe even aided with the binoculars. And tactics is moving men within that battle space. Operations would be the campaign on the level of a nation. So, for example, if we look at Julius Caesar, the Battle of Alesia is tactics. His invasion of Gaul is operations. And strategy would be, or actually, let's give an even better example, Scipio Africanus. Tactics is the capture of Cartagena. Operations is the Spanish campaign. And strategy is Scipio Africanus' broader goal of destroying Carthage. Now, the Germans Prussia had already most Europeans had already professionalized tactics. Drill had been rediscovered in the 16th century by reading Roman sources, but operations was not professional until the Germans. The Prussian state professionalized it with Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, and Clausewitz. And those three guys they basically realized that a Napoleon is a once in a millennium figure. And if you want to have consistent military success, you need to institutionalize the spirit of Napoleon. And since you can't wait for a genius, you can't wait a century or a millennium, you have to institutionalize it. But it's not just war. Germans ended up institutionalizing success in general, in economic success, scientific success, philosophical success. They ended up they created these institutions of excellence. And I think that's the final contribution to the German character.
Yeah, one great book, in our conversations leading up to this video where we were talking about, I'm sorry, what's the game again? Europa Universalis. Yeah, you talked about how you like to spend a lot of your, the first portions of the game building the economy, and I think that is really important. And that's a lot of, for the most part, that's what the Germans did. There's a really good book called The Conquest of Nature by a guy named David Blackburn, and he talks about how it's basically a book about how the Germans have altered the Rhine River since the Middle Ages to kind of benefit them and to prevent flooding and to speed up the waterway as it dumps into the North Sea. But a lot of people don't know that there's actually tons and tons of tributaries throughout Germany that give it really an economic advantage against its other regional competitors. So they did a good job, slowly over the centuries of fully utilizing their waterways. And again, the Danube connects Munich all the way to the Black Sea. So I think that's a really big important factor as well. But I think, yeah, that's about all I have to say about that. But a lot of people, I think, in the geopolitics, speaking in terms of European geopolitics, don't really talk about the German use of waterways. And yeah, I think it's really important.
Now, when we look at geopolitical pressures that are being put on Prussia/Germany, when we look at Prussia, which initially has no so one of the general mandates of geopolitics is that nations will expand. They tend to seek to expand up to a point where there's a natural barrier. So if we look at the Kingdom of France, they wanted to expand to the Rhine because that was a natural barrier. They wanted to expand to the Pyrenees Mountains, and that's a natural barrier. They wanted to expand to the Alps because that was a natural barrier. So Prussia has no natural barriers. And that's, of course, why they have to rely on an army to such a degree. So the early stages of their expansion tend to be towards geographic barriers, or the other rule of geopolitics is you expand in a vacuum where there's a weak political center. So to the east is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is weak. It's a politically weak system that's ultimately gobbled up by 1795. So there is a lot of expansion to the east because Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is easy pickings. But there's also a lot of expansion to the west. And in fact, at the Napoleonic settlement at Vienna, Prussia, Germany, for the first time gets a large amount of Rhineland coast because it's like, we got to stop France from just moving into the Rhineland whenever they feel like it. And they knew that, by shoring up Germany's strategic position, that would aid. And then furthermore, with the unification of Bismarck, he then completed this expansionist project that was the result of Germany's tremendous suffering in the 30 Years' War. By 1871, they had a border on the Rhine and they had a border on the Alps. The Low Countries were inconsequential, but they were also marshy. So even if France wanted to invade, it would have been very difficult for them to do so. They had an open flank in the east, which Bismarck was able to tie up with treaties with Russia and Austria-Hungary called the Triple Alliance, which eventually would collapse, and we can get to that later. But when Bismarck consolidated, by 1885, Bismarck has consolidated Germany and dealt with all of Germany's strategic issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we'll probably get onto this a little later, but we can kind of touch on it now. One thing that really characterizes Germany in its military operations is the inability to trade time for land. You and I talked about this a lot, but this is something that Russia and basically any large nation can really afford. They can afford to sort of even if there's some operational disaster, at least there's hundreds, if not thousands of miles to their rear where they can just reorganize. Germany, Israel, probably different Mediterranean countries don't necessarily have that luxury. And so there has to be this very well planned, very calculated attack on all these sorts of assets. I think, for example, like in the Arab-Israeli wars, I think that it was something like 1 or 2/3 of Egypt's Air Force was shot up in one day, and they were still on the ground. It was because Israel had really good intelligence, via the United States, but they knew where all these really juicy and high value targets were. And so Germany has kind of oriented itself in its military thinking that way since the Franco-Prussian conflict. And again, because of, I mean, it's almost a cliche thing to say, but due to Germany's location on the European continent, with the North European plain taking up a lot of that real estate, they really have to have a well-planned and calculated strike. Otherwise, it's all over. And that, we saw how cataclysmic their defeat was in World War II because of not having that luxury. And yeah, I think that's where people kind of derive that Germanic military prowess from, is the ability to, again, Germany is really good at planning economically, militarily, intellectually, commercially, you name it. But again, Germany is actually very constrained just due to its landmass and its resources, and even to this day, infighting. So they have to, if they're going to go in, they typically go in big. Otherwise, they can't maintain a very long and sustained attrition type of a conflict or gestalt for themselves. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that.
Yeah, exactly. There's the Sun Tzu dictum that when you go to war, you want to make the other guy pay for it, so you fight on his soil, not yours. Well, it's common sense in general, but it's of vital importance for a relatively small country. And it's also not, it's more than just the fact that Germany is relatively small compared to, say, Russia or the British Empire or some of the other threats that it faced in the modern age. There's no fallback line. So for example, Russia's got these great river systems. There's the Dnieper, the Dniester, the Vistula, the Volga. So you can fall back from river to river to river. And rivers are classic defensive positions. Once the Rhine is pierced, Germany doesn't really have a defensible position to throw up once the Rhine is pierced. Or obviously no one's going to invade via the Alps, and Bavaria is fairly mountainous as well, which would contain threats. But once you pierce those barriers, though, there's really nowhere to throw up a defense conveniently. So the Germans really have to do that. And as I said, when it came to tactical performance, the German excellence was really enshrined with Frederick the Great. In the 18th century, a trained musketeer could maybe fire 2 shots in a minute. That was on a good day. On a good day, Frederick the Great his men could fire 3 shots in a minute. And also, due to the limitations of volley fire, you might have had 6 men deep. Frederick the Great got it down to 3 men deep. And the only person to do better than Frederick was Wellington, who got it to 2 men deep, from where we get the name the Thin Red Line, because it really was a thin red line. And then, of course, we saw with the Napoleonic period, they sort of perfect operations. And strategy has always been the German weakness. They as a part of a coalition partner, so the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, that's not really a big problem. Their tactical and operational success can be effectively used as a part of a coalition partner, and they tend to be very successful. Prussia overcame in horrible odds in the 7 Years' War. They helped defeat Napoleon at Waterloo, so they definitely can. But that strategic weakness was really profound in the 2 world wars, where Germany's need to get a quick knockout blow was unable to be delivered. Now, the other thing Germany has is the principle of the middle position. In tactics and strategy, if you have the middle position, you can strike out in all directions, which is one sense makes it easier on your logistics. But on the other hand, you're also surrounded. So it's on a tactical level, Napoleon used that a lot. He would get between armies and destroy each one in detail before they could unite. So the middle position tactically can be very effective, but strategically, it's more of a liability. And Germany just couldn't pick up and move where it was, because that's what its geography was. Now, as to why Germany's strategic skills were generally inferior to, say, the English, the Americans, and I wouldn't say the Russians. The Russians didn't do so hot either. But I would say it's partly because they had to focus. They're like Israel. They have to win quick, and they have to win big. And so really, I think it creates this impression that strategy is just less important, in the sense that if you have to get to that question, you've already lost the war in the first place.
Yeah, a great example. We've talked about it a lot, but in our World War II conversations, I think you and Keith were saying that, yeah, like the Third Reich and Italy in Europe really never had an ice cube's chance in hell of winning, simply due to the amount of what like the U.S. naval tonnage production was just through the roof, and we were building so many Sherman tanks that we were lend leasing them to various nations. Whereas, Germany really didn't have great, they had access to coal in the Saarland and partially in the Alps. And then later on, they would occupy the oil fields in Romania, which we then bombed in. I believe that was in 1943, 1944. But again, you're absolutely right that there's a limited window of time, but you typically have the ability to strike hard in that window of time if they hit all these crucial checkpoints that they have to against their adversary. But again, that just hasn't, I mean, even Germany was really successful on the Eastern Front of World War I as well. But again, especially in that war, even more than World War II, is that supply line lengths get insane, and there's only so much a country roughly the size of Montana can produce. So, yeah, I always thought that was kind of interesting, and again, it typically ends up creating a lot of interesting military figures in history, like what's the top Luftwaffe ace, Erich Hartmann, as well as Panzer aces like Otto Carius and Kurt Knipsel, and so on and so forth. So when in reality, like the winning side, like the Allies, I mean, yes, there were like great soldiers and tankers and snipers and you name it. They didn't really stick out as much because Germany was forced to like overperform in all these areas, and they had several individuals who did, and they had a long list of Luftwaffe aces. But again, yeah, Hitler never really geared the economy towards a war for attrition. He geared it towards quick victories. Again, like everything that was attained in 1940, I think he was hoping that that's how things were going to go in the Eastern Front. That just was not the case.
Now, the sort of last piece of the puzzle before we can begin the discussion of the 20th century German strategic needs is the economy. Because when you listen to what needs to be said is looking at the territory that Tacitus calls Germania was essentially impoverished, poor wilderness. The Italy, Greece, by this point even Gaul, were very wealthy, relatively speaking. And throughout the Middle Ages, that did not change. Even up through the Renaissance, that did not change. The wealth disparity between North and South we see today in Europe is solely due to the Reformation, where there was a cultural revolution in these Northern Europeans, where they, like in Holland, where they drained the swamps, and then in Scandinavia, where they cut down the trees, and in Germany. So, but there's this economic genius that the Germans have, and it begins with the common market in the middle of the 19th century. And this is kind of more your wheelhouse. So why don't you explain the rise of the German economy?
Well, yeah, like we were talking about in our previous conversations, this point really kind of came up between when you and Keith were discussing sort of, I believe it was your video where it was something titled like, are the elites just capitalists anymore? And one of the things in that conversation that was kind of argued for fairly convincingly by Keith is that there's most modern economies today are some form, more or less, a hybrid between capitalism and socialism, but it's against the backdrop of a very complex and over-engineered sense of bureaucratization. So again, the Germans, I think, were good in terms of managing their bureaucracies because, for one, there was some families early on that ended up contributing a lot to what would eventually become the nation state of Germany. For example, like the Krupp family and Krupp steel is a huge one, and I think these are all weapons, but like Mauser and I think, Opal, and there were people early on. Again, this goes all the way back to the Guild Age, where there was this, even despite the low populations of the Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there within Germany, there was still these small concentrations of very skilled workers, which more or less survived, into the Industrial Revolution. And just again, like you and I were speaking about earlier, by 1900, you could probably argue that the German economy was more dynamic and robust than the Americans. For example, with the invention of the like submachine gun and the monoplane, and they even they were coming up with better ways of running pieces of equipment like lathes and cutting steel. And yeah, Germans have been very efficient steel workers since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So there again was always this drive to do that. And again, I think maybe this is a little bit of environmental determinism, but again, due to the neighboring factors, the Germans have always had a real sense of like vitality and urgency. Not because, oh, we think we're cool because we are that way. It's like, no, we actually have to, because we're on the Germans are always on a clock one way or another. Again, if you go around to Europe these days, you will speak to a lot of people in the public who, in the back of their mind, are still afraid of of Vladimir Putin, or if Russia might do something in the name of some sort of land grab in the NATO buffer. But to tie that back to the German economy, yes, while Hitler for World War II, for example, didn't really gear the economy for a long-term conflict, the economy in Germany has always been well-rounded. In the geopolitics video between you and Keith, you guys talked a lot about how when the Soviet Union received a lot of its money from Western firms, most of that money was thrown into the armory, into these tank factories. Whereas when Germans were a beneficiary of the Marshall Plan, well, it was very divided amongst steel industry and coal and electrical, and not to say that Russians aren't incapable of doing that, but there's a much higher concentration of a more educated workforce in Germany than there probably is in Russia. And they've just basically been forced to do that in order to stay relevant. Otherwise, they'll either get conquered from the east, or they'll be made irrelevant economically from the United States and Great Britain and France.
Now, when we look at the German strategic interests in the 20th and 21st centuries, the sort of relative peace that's held since the end of World War II is unique in European history. One of the selling points of the European Union is that it's kept Europe at relative peace for so long. Now, so we need to divide it into two periods, from, say, 1900 to 1945, where you have two world wars, and then from 1945 until today, where you have relative peace in Europe. Now, if you look at the First World War, I said a lot about this in various places. So the basic strategic pressures are this. England correctly fears Germany as an economic rival, as we've seen now that Germany is hovering around 4th or 5th place in GDP, far ahead of England. It's outstripped England. And by 1913, in steel and coal, they were about to wrest England's monopoly away from the leading production. But ultimately, one can argue whether England's wars with Germany facilitated the decline that would be even faster. But regardless, Germany was a serious economic competitor to England. And John Maynard Keynes, in his Consequences of the Peace, points out that was England's primary strategic interest, to neuter that economic threat. France was revanchism for Alsace-Lorraine, and Russia wanted a free hand to deal with the Balkans and Ottoman Empire. And looking back at the 1878 war with Turkey and how the European powers intervened to force Russia to cough up its gains, those were the pressures that the Allies had to unite and put aside their differences against Germany. Germany's strategic problem was this. Russia was vast, and the expectation was a strike east would just get bogged down, and the Germans needed a quick victory. Austria is an ally, so that's great. England's an island, and they can't invade an island. France, they thought would have been the best bet, and they wanted to do a knockout blow on France. In hindsight, looking how unstable the Russian regime was, they might have done better to strike out at Russia first, consolidate vast lands in the east, and then be blockade proof, because they could then capitalize on the Russian grain from the Ukraine, the natural resources of the east. But everybody was thinking in terms of Napoleon. Russia just swallowed up Napoleon's armies. Russia swallowed up Charles XII of Sweden. So the Germans were operating off that historic paradigm. And France had been knocked out relatively quickly in 1870. So we look back and say, the Schlieffen Plan was stupid. How could anybody believe that? But looking at European history up until 1914, it makes perfect sense. Russia is this giant black hole that sucks up armies, and France had been knocked out in 6 weeks. Now, it didn't happen to be the case at all. That's what happened in World War I. Part of it was due to technology. Part of it was due to mass armies, where now you have millions of men in uniform. Communication begins to break down. Encirclements become almost impossible. And so it settles into the kind of war Germany really can't win, a war of attrition. It turns out Russia couldn't win that war of attrition either, and bailed out in 1917. But the point is, the actual strategic decisions that Germany made were rational and sensible within the information they had at the time, even though the Eastern Strike, which was floated, probably would have been in the long run the winning gambit for Germany in World War I. And ultimately, all of these strategic factors, you have to win quickly. The longer it goes, the less likelihood you have of winning. Germany's chances became increasingly reduced. And even so, in 1918, when they launched the Michael Offensive on the Western Front, they almost destroy they almost separate the BEF from the French army to destroy the BEF in detail. But it's with the entry of the Americans at the Second Battle of the Marne where they're decisively checked and their encirclement plan ends. So at that point, Germany's out of gas. It fell into the trap of a battle of attrition. And really, the only thing you could say is that if Germany were to have won, they would have had to have won the diplomatic war prior to World War I. And the balance that Bismarck had set up, the Kaiser had allowed to lapse. And it was the lapsing of that political system that allowed for these nations to come together to bring their weight to bear to destroy the German state. And that's sort of like the TLDR for Germany's World War I strategic goals. Your thought?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Again, I think one thing that was always interesting in World War I was the secret Russian-Franco alliance too. I think that you had a good post on your blog about how Great Britain and especially the Franco-Russian secret treaty did a lot to escalate the war into probably a state that it didn't necessarily have to be in. And again, a lot of people don't talk about how a big motivating factor for Great Britain in World War I was the fact that Germany was competing so economically well, and it started getting assets abroad in Southern Africa, and I think it's like Cameroon and parts of Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. So I think England was very nervous about a lot of the steel production and innovation coming out of there too. So yeah, I think when there is it took them centuries, but when France and England finally did start forming these alliances and coalitions later on in this modern period, that's what it honestly does take to beat a Germany who's typically poised to strike super fast and really hard, while also at the same time maintaining a dynamic economy. And as for I don't know if you want to do this, but kind of segueing into like 21st century politics, as you stated before, I think the first important thing to say is that the EU, yes, it has a good selling point that it's maintained this relative peace in general. But I think, if you look up a lot of kind of low hanging fruit normie videos that are all animated that explain the European Union, one of the biggest takeaways that you take away from all of that is that it's so over engineered and so overly complicated about how it maintains itself. And it basically, you've got like nameless, faceless bureaucrats writing laws for people. These bureaucrats are in Brussels, and well, actually in Strasbourg, but they're writing laws for people in in Sofia and Bucharest and places that they'll never see or probably live in or spend that much time in or have a connection to. So really, for Germany, it's got three big items on its geopolitical table. It's got Russia, its relationship with the European Union, and Germany really is the heart of the European Union simply due to its waterways, because the EU basically gives Europe a monopoly on the sort of the material markets that benefit their use of the waterways. Again, like moving steel, and it's the most traveled. The Rhine is the most traveled waterway, I believe, in Western Europe, and one of the busiest waterways in the world. And again, that's all the other tributaries that flow out of the Rhine. It's the same case. And then the third biggest item on the geopolitical checklist is the United States. Because the United States has such a powerful navy, a lot of the times the Danish Straits and the North Sea and the Baltics are sometimes dominated by the United States in a sort of kind of in a private sphere sort of way, but also militarily. So a lot of the times Berlin is kind of trying to keep itself relevant to the United States. But I think the biggest thing that they have to deal with, if there's ever going to be another big conflict in Europe in the next 20 to 60 years, I'm virtually certain that it would include Russia, and it would probably be some sort of resurgent quasi-nationalist Russia, where they'd probably want to do a land grab somewhere between the German border and they'd probably want to get parts of Belarus or Ukraine. They'd probably want Kiev. They'd probably want to get their economies under the Kremlin's control again. But again, yeah, Germany's job has always been to keep Paris and Moscow at bay and simply just do its best on a diplomatic effort while being allowed to dominate economically. One interesting thing that Germany has always tried to do in the EU is that they've like wanted Poland and Belarus and a lot of the Baltic states to gain membership status, and that's what's created as known as the NATO buffer, and that gives them again a little bit of breathing room, like we were talking about earlier with trading land for time. That can give the Germans some potential time to, if they had to mobilize, they probably could. Interestingly enough, with the Bundeswehr, they actually have the majority of their tanks, their Leopard 2s, are actually in storage. And they have enough detachments available for their army to train and do maneuvers with and war games with the various NATO allies and members. But the majority of all their stuff is in storage if they ever need it. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, the NATO buffer is a big variable if a potential war were to ever break out with the EU and Russia. And interestingly enough, too, there was a leaked document called the Strategic Perspective, or 2040, the Strategic Perspective. And it's basically Germany's, it's basically their economic and military battle plan if the EU ever does collapse. And the language and kind of how it's written almost suggests that they're kind of sort of planning on it happening. So I don't know a ton of details about it. I didn't read all of it, but kind of watching a few videos on it and read some of it, getting a sense they're kind of anticipating, again, what happened with Brexit and what's happening with the resurgence of nationalist parties in Germany. I think that Germans are, on a political level, are anticipating that to happen throughout Europe, and it's already kind of started in Hungary. So again, if the EU is done away with, that will, again, Germany will be forced to, on its own, either retain those markets that are associated with their waterways, and they will kind of come into a new sort of political paradigm where they will have to maintain a really good membership with countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, because if something bad does happen, like a repeat of the Eastern Front, well, then if Germany wants to be on the winning side this time, then they will have to probably lean harder on their allies. And what I could see happening is probably like a German version of like a Lend-Lease to like, a quasi-satellite state like Ukraine. And Germans are pouring tons of money and political advisors and trainers into those countries. And perhaps they would even just mobilize and have the permission of those countries to station troops and set up divisions and corps and armored divisions and airfields, you name it. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, if we look at Germany's current European Union goals, right now, I think the liabilities in the ledger would be those liabilities often shared with other European powers. So, for example, a relatively low fertility rate. So any sort of long-term military conflict that might arise would put serious strain on the German population, but it would also put serious strain on any European nation's population today because they have such low fertility rates, averaging around 1.5 TFR per woman. Another factor they have with other Europeans is a large hostile immigrant population that refuses to integrate and accept European norms. In Sweden, it's Somalia, Somalis. For Germany, it's Turks. For France, it's, I think, more Algerians and Syrians. And so the internal issues would probably be Islamic. Because these groups are completely isolated from any sort of neighboring Islamic country, they probably wouldn't make it very well. And in fact, using them as a weapon, especially as the Turkish population, Erdogan has boasted that he could use the Turks to cause trouble in NATO if they don't do what he wants them to. So it is a threat that's on the table. And the other threat on the table is Russia. Now, when we look at, and if the European Union totally collapses, traditional threats might reemerge like France. I think Poland would remain in the German orbit because they cannot fight Russia alone. They cannot fight Germany alone. And the last century has indicated that Germany is a much better master than Russia. So I think all of Eastern Europe would traditionally go back in Germany's sphere of influence in order to stay free from Russia. And then, France could just do it in its juices, I guess. And then England, England's not really in a position to do much anymore. That's the thing. It's really just kind of a spectator to the European project. But here's what they have in their advantage. They have a robust, diverse economy with diverse exports, and they have domestic arms manufacture. They have, highly sophisticated optics, firearms, tank equipment. They could, not only equip their own forces, but allied forces with state-of-the-art modern equipment on par with anything you'd find in the United States, Great Britain, or Israel. Second of all, they have a highly literate, highly trained population, which could also be effectively used. Basically, from Vietnam until the first Gulf War, there was a revolution that happened where warfare became extremely capital intensive. In the Vietnam War, the United States had like 50,000 casualties over a 10-year period. The first Gulf War, it's like 1,000, and for every American casualty, there were 300 Iraqis. With what ends up happening when war becomes capital intensive, conscription is much less important. The Iraqi army was the fourth largest army in the world, and the NATO coalition just utterly obliterated it in a few weeks, a few days, just obliterated. So the Germans have everything you need to make that modern army work. They've got the logistical backup. They've got, and of course, in any such conflict, the United States and Britain would probably be at least benign neutrals, if not active allies, because an Islamic threat or a Russian threat would not be in their interest either. Germany would have highly trained professional soldiers with, in fact, during the Cold War, Soviet military planners said that the most efficient and well-trained forces in the NATO armories were the West Germans, and the ones they were calculated on giving them the most problem. And I don't see any reason to think that still isn't the case in Europe. So the real question is, how long could they last in a protracted conflict? I think any conflict with Islamic insurgents would not be protected, because where would the Islamic insurgents get support from? They're completely isolated from the Islamic world. Russia well, here's the thing: Russia's got a huge population problem as well. So it's unlike World War II, where Russia could just have this war of attrition and lose millions of men. That would be unthinkable today. Russia could not do that. And so the attrition factor is just as a problem for Russia as it is for Germany. In fact, it's a larger problem because much of what Russia needs to do is use its large army to suppress non Russian ethnic minorities in the Russian Federation. And if they lose too many men fighting in Eastern Europe, well, those minorities will feel their oats and Chechnya might blow up again. Other parts of the Russian state might blow up. Whereas Germany, at worst, has to deal with a small Turkish enclave, which, and if we're honest, they could probably mop up in a month or so if they really wanted to just get rid of them. So I think vis-a-vis Russia, Germany would be in a better position than it's ever been, actually. And so the other thing you brought up in private discussion was if the European Union were to consolidate into a European Union army. Well, that'd be a boon for Germany because we all know the officer corps and training would be German. They get a lot of military contracts because that army would want the best, and the best is German. So that would be a military powerhouse if that ever got off the ground. There might be, reasons for, the Americans or the English to not want that to happen, but it depends. If European Union disintegrates, I think Germany is in a fairly well-positioned area. Again, I don't see armed conflict breaking out soon, but should it break out, I think Germany is actually in a better position than it's ever been because many of its historical rivals are either defeated or extremely neutered. France is essentially a non-entity. England is a non-entity, and Russia has been extremely neutered. So I think whatever comes Germany's way, peace or war, it's a better position than it's ever been to weather those storms, with the exception of demographics, but that's affecting everyone. So we can then rule out that it's a uniquely German factor.
Yeah, man, that's well said. I think as far as we're probably getting close to the end here, so I'll just have kind of an ending statement. But yeah, again, if any conflict were ever to break out in Europe, it would almost certainly involve Russia. And just as you and Keith discussed in the the Russian geopolitics video, the Russian military is really a tiny fraction from what it used to be when it was a Soviet juggernaut. And it's true that the Russian army actually has a ton of reserves, I think numbering into the millions. The thing is that I don't know what the standards are for those reserves, and a lot of those reserves have ended up fighting as pro-Russian separatist forces in Ukraine. And if some of the footage and journalism that's come out of that is any evidence, well, I mean, a lot of these vehicles are like old BMPs that have been around since the 80s, and they're just surviving off of an old surplus of parts. None of these guys have matching camo. Some of these dudes are like visibly drunk on vodka. So not to say that they're a bad army. It's just that they have a large number of reserves, but the regular army, I don't know, in a sustained war with high-tech air war assets that are now involved, like, high-tech jets and artillery and, facing up against Leopard 2s. It's true that the Russians have a tank called the T-14 Armata, but I don't know what the production numbers are on those. And again, I think Ukraine, for all of its domestic issues, would probably side with Germany rather than Russia, again, having to face another occupation similar to what it was under the Soviet Union. And as for Germany, I think its modern issues really are domestic in the sense that German society is highly secularized, and with this decline of religion, I think there's a lot of extreme white guilt from World War II and World War I, and guilt associated over the Holocaust, and a hyper liberal public education apparatus. I think, and as well as with below replacement level fertility rates and the migrant crisis of 2015, Germany's issues are really kind of psychological and spiritual as far as within their own country goes. But again, if some continental conflict were to break out, I think it would be with Russia, and it would be with some coalition more or less with the French, the Italians, and They're closer, neighbors, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and so on and so forth. I'm sure it would involve Poland as well. Uh, but yeah, I think Germany's issues really are societal and psychological, and whether or not that they can find a way to move forward while still being happy and proud to be German without, I don't know, giving off the wrong nationalistic vibes. I think a nationalistic Germany at this point would be fine, and I would personally prefer that rather than the over uh, engineered complexities of the EU and various unionisms. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on that.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on Criminal Philosophy. It was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your channel, and I look forward to it if we ever do it again.
Thank you. This is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast signing